shores of the Jordan River as dozens of dead fish were spotted there. Have a look at this. You can clearly see a multitude of dead fish floating in the water. We'll get a better
Someone
shot.
walked to the Jordan River one morning, expecting nothing unusual. What they found stopped them cold. Hundreds of fish, lifeless, floating, stretching as far as the eye could see. The smell hit before the sight did, and the further they walked, the worse it got. Miles of it. But here is the part nobody is talking about. This river isn't just any river, and what is happening inside it right now has been written about in ancient texts thousands of years before any of us were born. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what this river is. Not just geographically, not just scientifically, but what it means. The Jordan River runs from the snow-capped peaks of Mount Hermon in the north. It flows south through the Sea of Galilee, and it ends at the Dead Sea, a river that connects life to death by its very design. But along the way, something extraordinary happened on its banks. Not once, not twice, but over and over again throughout human history. And that is what makes what is happening right now so difficult to ignore. Cast your mind back thousands of years. A nation of people stood trembling at the edge of this river. They had been wandering in a desert for 40 years. 40 years of hunger, doubt, and survival. And now, the only thing standing between them and the land they had been promised was the Jordan. It was flood season. The water was high. The current was strong. There was no way through. And then the water stopped. Not slowed, not thinned. Stopped. The entire flow of the river held back, as if an invisible wall had been placed upstream, and an entire nation walked across on dry ground. That moment was not just history. It was a declaration, a statement that this river was under a different kind of authority. But that was only the beginning. Years later, a prophet named Elijah stood at the edge of the same river. He took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water. And the Jordan split apart. A dry path opened. He walked through. When Elijah was taken into heaven, his student Elisha was left standing alone on the bank. He picked up the cloak that had fallen. He struck the water with it, and the river split again. The same river, the same miracle, a different man, as if the Jordan itself was confirming that the power was not in the person. It was in something far greater. And then came the moment that changed everything. A man walked into the Jordan River. Not a king, not a general, not a priest. He was a carpenter from a small town that most people had never heard of. He waded into the water. He was baptized. And when he came up out of the river, those standing nearby said the sky opened. A voice spoke, and something descended like a dove and rested on him. That man was Jesus. And that moment in the Jordan River became one of the most significant events ever recorded in human history. This is not just a river. It is the place where water obeyed a command, where prophets performed the impossible, where heaven itself broke through into the physical world. Generations of people have traveled from every corner of the earth just to stand on its banks, just to touch its water, just to feel connected to something larger than themselves. Pilgrims have wept there. Prayers have been spoken there in dozens of languages. People have been baptized in those same waters, tracing the footsteps of something ancient and sacred. The Jordan is not background scenery in the story of faith. It is one of the main characters. So when something goes wrong in the Jordan River, it is not a footnote in an environmental report. It is a headline that cuts straight to the heart of millions of people around the world. And right now, something is very wrong. The river that once stopped flowing on command is now barely flowing at all in places. The water that once carried the weight of divine encounter is now carrying something else entirely. Something that has left scientists scrambling for answers, and left those who know their scripture quietly reaching for their Bible. Because what is floating in the Jordan River right now was described a very long time ago, and the description is uncomfortably precise. It started with a smell. Before anyone saw anything, they smelled it. A heavy, rotting stench drifting up from the water's edge. The kind of smell that tells you something has gone wrong before your eyes can confirm it. And then they saw them. Fish. Hundreds of them. Floating on the surface of the Jordan River. Belly up. Lifeless. Drifting slowly with the weak current. One witness said they walked just a small section near a local park and counted what looked like hundreds of dead fish in that stretch alone. Then they kept walking. And the fish kept coming. Clumps of them. Miles of them. Covering the surface of a river that was already running dangerously low. Here is what made it worse. The Jordan River is not what it used to be. Not even close. 100 years ago, the Jordan carried around 1.3 billion cubic meters of water every year. Today, that number has collapsed. Some estimates put the current flow at less than 3% of what it once was. 3%. The river that split for profits. The river that swallowed armies. The river that carried the weight of one of the most significant moments in human history. Now reduced to a shallow, slow-moving stream in many places. Muddy. Narrow. Struggling. In some sections, you could wade across it in seconds. The reasons are not mysterious from a scientific standpoint. Water has been diverted upstream for agriculture and human use on both sides of the border for decades. Untreated sewage has been pumped into its tributaries. Industrial and agricultural chemicals have seeped into its flow. The Sea of Galilee, which feeds the Jordan from the north, has itself dropped to dangerously low levels multiple times in recent years. The river is being drained, polluted, and slowly suffocated. And when you reduce a river to a fraction of its flow and fill it with chemicals and waste, the oxygen levels in the water drop. Fish cannot survive without oxygen. They rise to the surface looking for air, and then they die. That is the scientific explanation. Clean, logical, straightforward. But here is where it gets complicated. Because the Jordan River is not the only place this is happening. In recent years, mass fish die-offs have been reported across the world. In rivers, in lakes, in coastal waters. Millions of fish washing up on shores with no immediate explanation. Entire ecosystems going quiet in ways that scientists are still trying to fully understand. The Jordan is one river, but it sits inside a much larger pattern. And that pattern has a name in ancient scripture. Go back to the book of Hosea, written thousands of years ago. The prophet is delivering a warning to a people who have turned away from what is right. And in the middle of that warning, he writes something that feels less like ancient poetry and more like a news report. He says the land mourns. He says everything in it wastes away. He specifically names the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea. The fish of the sea are dying. That is a direct line from an ancient text to a modern headline. And before you dismiss that as coincidence, consider this. Hosea was not writing about pollution. He did not know about agricultural runoff or chemical waste. He was writing about something else entirely. He was writing about the consequences of a world that had lost its way spiritually. And yet here we are, thousands of years later, watching the fish die in the exact river where some of the most powerful divine encounters in history took place. The scientists are not wrong. The pollution is real. The water diversion is real. The oxygen depletion is real. But the question that remains is this. Is it possible for something to have both a natural explanation and a prophetic one at the same time? Because if the answer to that is yes, then what we are seeing in the Jordan River is not just an environmental crisis. It is a signal. And signals only matter if someone is paying attention. Keep watching. Because the next part is where this stops feeling like a coincidence entirely. Let's be fair to the science first. Because dismissing it entirely would be dishonest. And the science tells a serious story on its own. The Jordan River sits in one of the most politically complex and water-stressed regions on Earth. Multiple countries draw from the same water sources. Demand has skyrocketed over the past century as populations have grown. And the infrastructure needed to protect the river has never been properly built or maintained. The result is a river in crisis, not because of one bad decision, but because of decades of small decisions that all pointed in the same direction. Take more, give less back, and nature eventually sends a bill. The fish dying in the Jordan are a symptom, not the disease. The disease is a river that has been reduced to less than 3% of its natural flow. A river where tributaries now carry sewage instead of clean water. A river where the salinity levels have risen so high in certain sections that most species simply cannot survive there anymore. Scientists who study the Jordan have been raising alarms for years, decades even. They have written reports, held conferences, presented data to governments and organizations across the region, and the river kept shrinking. So from a purely scientific standpoint, the dead fish are not a mystery. They are the predictable outcome of a long chain of human decisions. The science is settled on the cause, but the science cannot answer the question that keeps surfacing when people stand on the banks of that river and look at what is floating there. Why this river? Of all the rivers on Earth that are suffering from pollution and overuse, why does it feel different when it is this one? Why does a report about fish dying in the Jordan land differently than a report about fish dying somewhere else? Because context matters, history matters, and the history of this river is unlike anything else on the planet. And that is where the science reaches its limit. It can explain the how. It cannot explain the weight of the moment. It cannot explain why standing on the banks of the Jordan, watching life drain from the water, feels like something more than an environmental report. That feeling has a name, and it is found in Scripture. Paul wrote a letter to the Romans nearly 2,000 years ago. In it, he described something that sounds remarkably like what environmental scientists describe today. He wrote that the whole of creation has been groaning, straining, like something in pain, waiting for something to change. He was not writing about pollution, but he was writing about a world out of alignment, a world where something had gone wrong at a level deeper than the surface. And creation, he said, feels it. The rivers feel it. The land feels it. The creatures within it feel it. That idea, that the natural world reflects the spiritual condition of humanity, is not a new one invented to fit this moment. It runs throughout the entirety of Scripture, from beginning to end. When things are right, the land flourishes. When things go wrong, the land mourns. And here is where science and Scripture stop arguing and start pointing in the same direction. Both agree something is wrong. Science says the cause is human behavior, overuse, pollution, neglect. Scripture says the same thing in different language, turning away from what is right, taking without giving back, consuming without conscience. The diagnosis is identical, only the vocabulary is different. So the real question is not science versus prophecy. The real question is whether the Jordan River dying is only about water management, or whether it is also a mirror, a reflection of something happening at a level that flow rates and chemical analysis cannot fully measure. And then there is the timing. Because the Jordan is not declining in isolation, it is declining at a moment when the rest of the world is also showing signs of strain that are very difficult to explain away as coincidence. Earthquakes in unusual places, weather systems behaving in ways that have no modern precedent, conflicts erupting in regions that have been flashpoints throughout biblical history, species disappearing, ecosystems collapsing. Every single one of these things has a scientific explanation, and every single one of them also appears in ancient prophetic texts describing what the world would look like in a particular season of history. That overlap is either the greatest coincidence in recorded time, or it is something else entirely. And what the Scripture says about this specific river, in this specific season, is the part that nobody seems to want to say out loud. But we are going to say it. Because once you hear it, the dead fish floating in the Jordan are going to look very different. Open the book of Hosea. It is one of the oldest prophetic texts in existence, written at a time when the idea of agricultural runoff and industrial pollution did not exist. written by a man who had never seen a chemical plant or a water diversion dam. And yet in chapter 4, verse 3, he writes this: "The land mourns, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea are swept away." Read that again slowly. The fish in the sea are swept away. This is not a metaphor buried deep in complicated language. This is a direct, clear statement, and it sits inside a larger warning about what happens to a world that has lost its moral and spiritual direction. Hosea was describing consequences, cause and effect on a scale that goes beyond human systems. He was saying that when humanity breaks its relationship with what is right and true, creation itself begins to break down. The fish die. Now look at what Ezekiel saw. In chapter 47, the prophet is given a vision of the future. He sees water flowing out from a great temple in Jerusalem. Just a trickle at first, then ankle deep, then knee deep, then a river too deep to cross. And wherever that river flows, life returns. He describes fish coming back in great numbers, the waters becoming fresh and clean, everything the river touches becoming alive again. Then, in verse 10, he describes fishermen standing along the shore from a place called En-Gedi all the way to En-Eglaim, spreading their nets. Because the fish are so abundant, there is no room for them all. En-Gedi sits on the western shore of the Dead Sea, the place where nothing lives, the saltiest, most hostile body of water on earth, the very place where the Jordan River currently ends its journey. And Ezekiel says that one day, even that place will be filled with life. But here is the part that stops you in your tracks. Between Hosea's warning and Ezekiel's promise sits a gap, a space between the dying and the restoration, a period where things get worse before they get better. And the markers of that period are described with uncomfortable precision throughout the prophetic books. Waters that cannot sustain life, creation groaning under the weight of human failure, the natural world reflecting the disorder of the spiritual world. Sound familiar? Move forward to the final book of the Bible, Revelation. John describes a series of events that unfold in a sequence. And inside that sequence, the waters of the earth become a focal point. He describes a time when a third of the sea creatures die, when fresh water sources become bitter and undrinkable, when the systems that sustain life begin to fail one by one. Now the important thing to note is this: these descriptions in Revelation are not presented as random disasters. They are presented as signs, markers, indicators that a particular moment in history has arrived. They are meant to be recognized. And if they are meant to be recognized, that means they are meant to look like something real, something visible, something that appears in news reports and eyewitness accounts and videos that people share with each other in disbelief, like fish dying in the Jordan River. But there is one more piece of scripture that ties this together in a way that is very hard to walk away from. In Luke chapter 21, Jesus is sitting with his closest followers. They ask him about the future, about what the end of the age will look like. And he gives them a list of signs to watch for. He mentions wars, earthquakes, famines. These are the ones people quote most often. But then he says something that gets far less attention. He says there will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. And on the earth, there will be distress among nations. People will be confused by the roaring and tossing of the sea, the roaring and tossing of the sea, the waters becoming unpredictable, threatening, out of their natural rhythm. Not a hurricane, not a specific storm, but a general condition of the waters of the earth behaving in ways that cause confusion and distress at a national and global level. Now stack all of that together. Hosea says, fish die when the world loses its way. Ezekiel describes a future restoration of the very waters that are currently dying, which means something has to die before it can be restored. Revelation describes water systems failing as a recognizable sign of a specific moment in history. And Jesus himself says, The waters of the earth will become a source of confusion and fear in the days before the age changes. Every single one of those texts points to water, to fish, to rivers and seas that can no longer sustain what they were designed to sustain. And at the center of all of it, geographically and spiritually, sits the Jordan River, the river where water obeyed a command, the river where prophets performed the impossible, the river where heaven broke through. That river is now carrying dead fish downstream, and ancient texts written thousands of years before this moment described it. If that does not make you pause, nothing will. But here is what most people miss entirely when they look at all of this. The prophecies do not end with the dying. They end with something else, something that reframes everything we have just covered. And that is where this goes next. The Jordan is not alone. That is the part that changes everything when you step back far enough to see the full picture. Because if this were only about one river in one country struggling with one environmental problem, it would be a sad story and nothing more. Rivers have been polluted before. Fish have died before. Water systems have been mismanaged before. But that is not what is happening. What is happening is a pattern. And patterns in Scripture are never accidents. In the past decade alone, mass fish die-offs have been recorded on every inhabited continent on Earth. Rivers in Europe, lakes in Asia, coastal waters in South America, inland waterways in North America. The events are different, the causes vary, but the outcome is the same. Life leaving the water. In some cases, scientists have blamed algae blooms caused by agricultural runoff. In others, it has been industrial contamination. In others, still the water temperature has shifted just enough to make survival impossible for species that have lived there for thousands of years. Each event has an explanation, but the frequency has no precedent in recorded history. And it is not just the water. The same period that has seen the Jordan River shrink and its fish die has also seen something else. The region surrounding the Jordan, one of the most prophetically significant patches of land on the entire earth, has become the center of global attention in ways that are difficult to explain through purely political analysis. Tensions that have simmered for generations have accelerated. Nations that rarely shared headlines are now sharing front pages. And the specific geography at the center of it all is the same geography described in ancient prophetic texts as the focal point of the final chapters of human history. That is not a political statement. It is an observation about the overlap between ancient prophecy and modern headlines. Go back to the words of Jesus in Luke 21. He does not describe the end of the age as a single dramatic event that arrives without warning. He describes it as a season, a period of accumulation, signs that build on each other, each one adding weight to the picture until the picture becomes impossible to ignore. He uses the image of a fig tree. When you see the leaves come out, you know summer is near. You do not need a calendar. You can read what you are seeing. He is saying, the signs work the same way. You do not need a theologian to tell you the season has changed. You can see it if you are paying attention. And what are we seeing? Fish dying in one of the most sacred rivers on earth. Water systems under stress across the globe. Ancient prophecy overlapping with modern news in ways that grow harder to dismiss with each passing year. And at the center of it all, a river that has historically been the place where the physical and the spiritual collided most visibly. The Jordan is not just struggling environmentally, it is struggling symbolically. And the symbolism is screaming. There is a concept that runs through the prophetic books that is easy to miss if you are reading quickly. It is the idea that before a great restoration, there is always a great unraveling. Before the river brings life, it first shows its death. Before the healing comes, the wound has to be visible. Ezekiel's vision of living water flowing from the temple and bringing fish back to the Dead Sea is one of the most beautiful images in all of Scripture. But it is preceded by chapters and chapters of warning. of loss, of things falling apart. The beauty of the promise depends entirely on understanding the weight of the warning that comes before it. And we are living inside the warning. That is not a reason for despair. It is actually a reason for the opposite. Because if the warnings are proving accurate, then so are the promises. You cannot have one without the other. They are part of the same text, written by the same authors, pointing to the same conclusion. The fish dying in the Jordan are real. The pollution is real. The shrinking river is real. But so is every promise written about what comes after. The question is not whether the prophecies are true. At this point, the evidence for taking them seriously is stacking up faster than most people are comfortable acknowledging. The question is what you do with that information. Because prophecy was never written to be watched from a distance like a news report. It was written to be responded to create urgency, to make the reader or the listener ask themselves a question that goes much deeper than what is happening in a river thousands of miles away. It was written to make you ask, what is happening inside you? And that question leads directly to the one thing the dying Jordan and the ancient texts both point toward. The one thing that sits on the other side of every warning ever written. The thing that Ezekiel saw in his vision when the water began to flow and the fish came back. The restoration, and what that restoration looks like, and what it means for right now, for this moment, for the world as it currently stands, is the final piece of this. And it is the piece that most people never reach. Ezekiel was standing in a valley of dry bones when he received his most famous vision. Not a garden, not a riverbank, not a place of beauty or life. A valley of dry bones, the most hopeless image imaginable. Death as far as the eye could see. And in that valley, God asked him a question. Can these bones live? Ezekiel did not answer with confidence. He said only that God would know. Because from where he was standing, there was no logical reason for hope. And then the bones came together. Flesh returned. Breath filled them. And an entire valley of death became a field of life. That vision was not just about bones. It was about the pattern. Death before life. Winter before spring. The valley before the mountain. The Jordan River in its current state is a valley. Shrunken. Polluted. Carrying death on its surface, where it once carried history on its waters. But Ezekiel also saw the Jordan's future. Or at least the future of the waters connected to it. He saw living water flowing east from Jerusalem, growing deeper as it moved, bringing life to everything it touched, turning salt water fresh, filling the most barren sea on earth with fish, so numerous that fishermen could not contain them. That vision has not happened yet, which means it is still ahead. And if the warning signs surrounding that vision are proving accurate in real time, then the promise at the end of it deserves the same serious attention. This is the part that tends to get lost in the noise of prophecy content. The warnings are dramatic. They are easy to package, easy to point to, easy to feel urgency about. But the warnings exist inside a larger story that ends not with death, but with restoration. Not with dying rivers, but with living water. Not with fish floating lifeless on a shrinking stream, but with abundance so great it cannot be measured. That is not a comfortable, soft ending, bolted onto a dark message to make people feel better. It is the actual conclusion of the prophetic narrative. The Jordan dying is not the final chapter. It is evidence that the story is still moving, that history has not stalled, that something is building toward a conclusion that the ancient writers described with extraordinary consistency across hundreds of years and dozens of different authors. And for those standing at the edge of that river today, whether physically or metaphorically, the message is not panic, it is preparation. Not the kind of preparation that involves stockpiling or retreating from the world. The kind of preparation that happens internally, quietly, in the space between what we see happening around us and what we choose to do about what is happening inside us. The Jordan is speaking. It has always spoken. From the moment it stopped flowing for the Israelites, to the moment it carried the voice of heaven at a baptism in its shallows, it is speaking now. The only question that has ever mattered when a river speaks is whether anyone is standing close enough to listen. And what happens to those who do listen is the part this has been building toward from the very beginning. There is a detail about the Jordan River that most people never learn, even people who know its history, even people who have stood on its banks and been baptized in its water. The detail is this: every single miracle recorded on the Jordan River happened at a moment when things looked finished. The Israelites arrived at the river during flood season, the worst possible time to cross. The water was not low and calm, it was high and dangerous, and it stopped. Elijah and Elisha struck the water not in a moment of strength and confidence, but in a moment of transition and uncertainty, and the river split. Jesus was baptized not at the height of his public ministry, but at the beginning of it, before anyone knew who he was, before any miracle had been performed, before a single word of his teaching had been heard. The Jordan has always moved at the moments that looked the most impossible. So here is the question that this moment in history is quietly asking. If the river's lowest point has historically been the moment right before something extraordinary happens, what does it mean that the Jordan is now at its lowest point in recorded history? Not low by ancient standards, low by modern scientific measurement, objectively, verifiably, measurably at a level it has never reached in the time humanity has been keeping records. The fish are dying. The water is shrinking. The river that has stood at the intersection of heaven and earth throughout human history is struggling to survive. And somewhere in the gap between what science can measure and what Scripture has promised, an answer is forming. Not slowly, not vaguely, with a precision and a pace that is accelerating in ways that are becoming very difficult to explain. The Jordan River has carried miracles. It has carried history. It has carried the weight of divine promise from one generation to the next for thousands of years. And right now it is carrying dead fish. But if its entire history teaches us anything at all, it is that what the Jordan carries in one moment is never the end of the story. It has always been a river of what comes next. And what comes next is the part that ancient writers, prophets, and visionaries across thousands of years and dozens of generations all pointed toward with one voice. The water will flow again. The question is not if. The question is whether you will recognize it when it does.